Our liberties we prize, and our rights we will maintain. This is Iowa Civil Rights History Podcast, where we tell stories about the contribution Iowans and the state of Iowa has made to advance the civil rights movement. Past stories are being told, present actions will be highlighted, and preparation for the future will be discussed. Here is your host, Erick Nganyange.
Welcome to the Iowa Civil Rights History Podcast. Fort Des Moines, Iowa. It was the first place in the United States to train black men to become officers in the Army. And it was also the first place to train women to be in the military, right here in Des Moines, Iowa. I traveled to Fort Des Moines today to talk to Jeff Kluever. Jeff is a writer, speaker, educator, and the board member of the Fort Des Moines Museum. He is also a lifelong student of the Civil War. Jeff, welcome to the show.
It's good to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm interested about the Civil War thing. It seems like you're so interested in the Civil War. How long have you been studying that?
I got interested in the Civil War as a kid. I read a book called Rifles for Wadey, which is a young adult historical fiction book. Have been hooked since then. Was able to actually turn it into a profession for a little while. I was the education supervisor at Pamplin Historical Park and the National Museum of the Civil War Soldier in Petersburg, Virginia for a few years, and really enjoyed doing that. But now, back in Iowa, I've found other ways to try and scratch that itch.
Have you studied the pre-Civil War, what was going on in the country? Because there's some people talking about Civil War today, and I'm kind of curious about what do we have going on right now in terms of division and all that. Have you studied much of what led to the Civil War?
Yeah, I wouldn't consider myself an expert, but to a degree, there's no question that we have division in our country today, but I don't think we've reached anything close to the level as we did prior to the Civil War.
Yeah.
I think one major difference is that there isn't a singular divisive issue quite in the same way that there was in the Civil War. We are fighting about slavery. We can couch it in a million different ways. Oh, we don't like these tariffs. Well, why don't you like the tariffs? Well, because of the institution of slavery, you're producing all the raw goods, so tariffs are bad for you. Like, there's lots of different side arguments, but they all tie back to the one thing.
One thing, yeah.
And I don't know that we have a singular one thing that's
true.
dividing us in quite the same way. We certainly have, two parties, but there's not the one singular issue that is half of us are here and half of us are here. I mean, we literally had a state senator get beaten within an inch of his life on the Senate floor.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
Was that Charles Sumner?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we are talking about violence has erupted long before 1861 with Bleeding Kansas and all of the instances of. It's not the same, and hopefully it never even gets close to being the same. Obviously, that's bad.
That's
I mean,
true, yeah.
we had 700,000 people die as a result of those arguments.
That's a lot of people.
It is. But what we get out of it is the eradication of slavery in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, and not really the reconciliation all the time, but the reunification at least of the country. So there is an incredibly high cost, but there is a significant benefit to it.
There's a lot of people say Lincoln did not have constitutional rights to stop the southern states from seceding from the Union. What is your thought?
I am not a constitutional scholar. I can see both sides of the case. That's why there's a war. You can make the constitutional case, but the war settles the question without bringing the lawyers in. It's a fun historical sort of theoretical argument to make, but at the end of the day, let's pretend like they do have a constitutional right to secede. They still confiscated federal property. You can't do that. That's illegal. I mean, they tried John Brown for treason for taking over a federal armory. They took all of the federal armories in the South. That's what the battle over Fort Sumter is about. Like, they wanted a base, and the federal government told them, no, you can't have the base. And so even if you have a constitutional right, I don't know that you get to take all of the federal property. That still could be considered treason. But I don't know. I don't know what those. I don't have the constitutional scholarly background to get into the weeds of that. At the end of the day, the war settles that question.
Yeah, that's true.
It becomes a moot point.
Now, you wrote a book called Walking the Shadow.
Yep, Waking the Shadows.
Waking the Shadow. Is this a story about Civil War?
It is. It takes place actually after the Civil War with flashbacks to the war itself. It's about a 15-year-old girl who's been orphaned. Her family dies during the war, and she's now living with an uncle who's so traumatized by the war that he won't talk to her about what's happened. And so it's actually playing around with the themes that we've just been talking about. How do we remember? Should we remember? Is it better to forget a painful past or remember a painful past? Would you rather know or not know? And what are the benefits of both of those things? I wrote the book because I just kind of wanted to see if I could do it. I've always wanted to write a book, and I thought, gosh darn it, I'm going to get this done. I had no intention of ever publishing it, had no intention of ever doing anything with it, and it just sort of became a thing where I said, well, gosh, I've done the hard stuff. I might as well see if anybody wants to read it.
How long did it take you to write it?
So it probably took the better part of 4, maybe 5 years.
Okay.
Because I would write in spurts. I'd find a week where I had some time and I'd kick around a chapter or two, and then I wouldn't write for 2 months, which is a terrible way to do it. I don't recommend doing at all. So now with my second book, I've really tried to be better at, can I do 500 words a day? And I haven't achieved that, but I've written the second one much faster because you sort of stay in that headspace.
What is the second one about?
Second book is about the United States colored troops during the Civil War, the Battle of New Market Heights.
Okay.
New Market Heights is outside of Richmond, and I think it's 14 African-American men were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor after that battle. And it's one of those battles that even if you're sort of a Civil War historian, a lot of people don't know anything about. There's another battle called the Battle of New Market, which is it's in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, and people confuse the two, and they don't really know the story, and they certainly don't know about the United States colored troops who fight there. So it's another work of historical fiction, but this one's the first book. There's no real people. It's entirely imagined. This one, 3 of the main characters are real people based on their actual life and experiences, and then I have a 4th composite character, and it's based on the real events, and it's based on the actual timeline and the real history, which in some ways is helpful because you sort of always know what you're doing next, but in some ways it's really challenging because what you want to do isn't always what happened. You want to write this scene, but that didn't happen.
Yeah, it didn't happen, yeah.
And not only, it's not even just like literary license, like he wasn't there, so you can't
put him there.
I'm still enough of a historian that I can't like just objectively be wrong about something in there. So.
Oh man, is the second book out?
No, it's not. I'm about 2 chapters away from the first draft being done.
Okay.
So it's probably
sometime
another.
this year?
Yeah, probably sometime late this year, early next. The 160th anniversary of the battle will be in September of 2024.
Okay.
So it'll definitely be done by then.
Okay. The Fort Des Moines. What is your position here at the Fort Des Moines Museum?
I am a board member at the Fort. Yep.
Board member and historian of the museum?
I don't know if I give myself the title of historian. I am not claiming expertise. There are other people who know even more, but I do love telling the story of the fort.
Yeah. How did this whole thing came about?
The fort historically?
Yeah, the Fort Des Moines.
So this is actually the third of 3 Fort Des Moines. The first Fort Des Moines was over on the Mississippi River where the Des Moines River is there. It's built as a part of a series of forts that the United States government builds to try and protect the Native Americans from the settlers. We are not supposed to come this far west. Obviously, that's not what happens. And so the second Fort Des Moines is built in what is now downtown Des Moines at the confluence of the Raccoon and Des Moines River. There's not a city of Des Moines when the fort is built. The fort is the first thing there. But as the city is built up around it, it becomes a bad place to have a cavalry base. In cavalry base, you need to have a lot of room to roam on your horses and things like that. And so as the city grows up, they start to decide we need to move the fort. And so they move it to the south side of Des Moines in the location we are now. Start construction, I think, in 1901, and they open the base in 1903 as a cavalry base.
Okay. Was this the only base in the United States that black soldier will be trained, or there were more?
So there's some nuance there.
Okay.
We have there are African American troops in the United States Army from the Civil War on, and so they are stationed at various bases all over the place. In fact, the first troops to arrive at Fort Des Moines are Buffalo soldiers, black cavalry soldiers. They're not stationed here, but they stay here on their way back to whatever base they were heading towards. But with very, very few exceptions, you could not be a commissioned officer as a black man in the United States military. And so the first major historical moment in the Fort Des Moines history occurs in 1917 when we host the first officer training camp for black men in United States military history.
Oh.
So this is the first place where African Americans are going to be trained as commissioned officers. There, again, you could graduate from West Point and be a commissioned officer, but there have only been 3 black men who had done that because you had to get nominated by your state reps, and there weren't a lot of state reps who were nominating African Americans to go serve at West Point. So Fort Des Moines is the first place where we are intentionally training black men to be commissioned officers.
Oh, wow. And that was 1917?
1917, yep. The building we're in right now is Clayton Hall. It is one of the original 1903 buildings. And the cavalry base at that time was larger than this, but not nearly as big as it would be by like 1946. And then it's been constricted since then.
Okay.
So the original cavalry base would have extended from what is now Southwest 9th Street up to now Army Post Road, and then south down to, it's just open ground to the south, where Blank Park Zoo and Blank Park Golf Course are. All that's sort of open ground. The parade ground is still partially there. There's an apartment complex on the east, or on the east side of the parade ground, and the west side is still open. The original enlisted men's barracks are on the south side of the parade ground. Those are still there. Those are now
really?
apartment buildings.
Okay.
Then there were stables behind that. Some of those are there. Most of those are gone. That's now on the zoo property. This building I'm pointing out the window to is the officers' stables out there. But most of the original fort is gone.
Oh, it's gone.
Most of the buildings are gone. They've been sold off or divided up since the end of World War II. The base is constricted and gotten smaller and smaller and smaller.
So in 1917, how many black commissioners were trained here roughly?
Yeah, there's some dispute about this, but the number that you see cited most often is 1,250 men will arrive at some point in order to get trained as officers. They arrive in the spring of 1917, and they are going through an abbreviated training course. They're trying to shorten it because they want to train these men, commission them as officers, and then they are going to go be officers in segregated units because we're still a segregated military now. So they want to have black commissioned officers leading these black companies. So they're trying to get these guys through the training. 639 of them will draw commissions out of the 1,250, which is a pretty good percentage.
Pretty good number, yeah.
Yeah. And they will either be first lieutenants, second lieutenants, or captains.
And they were coming from all over the country.
Yes, yeah.
Come over here.
Yep. There are a few folks from Iowa who serve here, but the vast majority are not from Iowa. These are all for the most part, they are either college educated, college graduates, or they are already serving in the military, and this is their first opportunity to get a promotion.
Yeah.
These are, for the most part, highly educated men or highly experienced men who are very aware that they are part of this first class, this sort of experiment, if you will, and are attracted to it for that reason in many cases. So we have a lot of folks from Howard University, Hampton University, those historically black colleges on the East Coast who see this as an opportunity, not just to serve their country, but to sort of prove their value, prove their worth, prove their, that there are only so many ways that they're allowed to prove that value and worth, and this is a new one. And there's something about having those bars on your shoulder that it's hard to argue with. And so they see this very much as an opportunity to try and prove that worth in another way.
Why do you think United States Army picked this location as the place to train?
So there's a couple different reasons. The first is that there's essentially nobody here in 1917. This is a cavalry base, and many of those cavalry soldiers had been dispatched to the southwest to try and protect the southern border. And so they have a perfectly good base with almost nobody on it. So that's one reason. They also choose this place because they are initially worried that the men will get distracted, will potentially go AWOL if they put it in a major metropolitan area. So Howard University wants to host it, Hampton University wants to host it, but both of those are in big cities. And so they don't really want to put them there. They're worried if the camp fails, they'll get bad press. And so if you put it in Des Moines, Iowa,
hide them there.
There's not a lot to get distracted by. We're hardly, the south side of Des Moines doesn't even come that far south for the most part, and you're not going to get any of that negative press attention. But the most important reason is that the state of Iowa will take them. Many of your military bases are not interested in hosting the first, black training camp, but the governor of the state of Iowa welcomes them, says, yes, we will absolutely host the camp. So those are the primary reasons that they choose Fort Des Moines.
Tuskegee Airmen, because I had episode 2, and I seen their pictures over here. one of those guys were trained here?
No, so that
they were already.
The display we have in the museum for the Tuskegee Airmen is recognizing the men from Iowa who served as a Tuskegee Airman, but none of them trained here. So Tuskegee's obviously World War II. In World War II, this is a base for WACs, for women officers to be trained.
Yeah.
But we do have that small display to acknowledge Iowa's connection to the Tuskegee Airmen, because the state does send
12 men?
Yeah, that's right. 12. Yeah. I think it's 12.
Yeah.
To Tuskegee to train as pilots.
Talking about WACs, how did Fort Des Moines, when he started, were they thinking about also maybe women can be trained here?
Yes. Yeah. So we have two major historical milestones. The first is the Black Officer Training Camp in 1917. The second is this is the first WAC base to be opened in 1942.
In the country?
In the country.
Oh,
yep.
wow.
So this is the first place where they will train African-American men to be officers. This is the first place they'll train women to be officers in United States military history.
Interesting.
In some ways, they're similar stories. You know, we're entering into World War I. We think that we're going to be part of this war. Should we allow black men to be commissioned officers? Let's give it a try. Sort of the same idea into World War II. The war is already raging in Europe. We might be getting into this. We're probably going to need as much help as we can get. You know, women have always served in Red Cross sort of capacities.
Yeah.
They're not part of the military, so they don't get any benefits. Maybe we should have them in. And so they create what's called the WACs. And you'll see WAC spelled two different ways. You'll see WAC with two A's and WAC with one. WAC with two A's is Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. Auxiliary meaning you're sort of in. So they're not 100%. They don't receive all of the same benefits as the men do, but that's where they start. And in 1942, they'll select Fort Des Moines as the location to have this first base. I think there are ultimately 5 WAC bases through World War II. This is the first to open and the last to close. This place will train both commissioned officers, female commissioned officers, and enlisted women.
Okay.
And so during World War II, we will have some estimates around 70,000 women who are trained at Fort Des Moines.
Wow.
We don't have an official account. That's the high-end estimate that I've seen.
That's a lot.
They're bringing so many, in fact, that they build really the entire southern half of the base is almost exclusively barracks. They call it Boomtown. They're constantly building more and more and more barracks to try and house the women because they don't have enough places to put them. They will house them in the city of Des Moines. I think Drake University houses some of them and has some of their classes there. But yes, this base has 2 of those major civil rights milestones. And that's sort of one of the things that we try and talk about here at the museum is I think Iowa doesn't always see it as itself as part of a civil rights narrative. Yeah. Those things happened in Selma and Birmingham. But we have 2 pretty significant moments just in this space, let alone all the ones that happened outside of Fort Des Moines, but just here in this one place on the south side, we've got 2 pretty important moments.
So you say WACs, there's 2 A's. There's auxiliary and...
So in 1943, they're now deploying women overseas. And they say, you know what, they should just be in. And so they change WAC with 2 A's to WAC with 1. Now it's just Women's Army Corps. They're no longer auxiliaries. And so they will be just enlisted into the Women's Army Corps and serve there for the remainder of the year, or for the remainder of the war, rather. They serve in every non-combat role that you can imagine. They will never be on the front lines for combat, but they're not just doing administrative work or postal battalions. They're doing mechanical work. Some of them are trained to fly planes. They do air traffic control. They're deployed to every theater. So they really go from nothing, go from not even being allowed into the military into doing basically every job the military has aside from direct combat roles.
Wow. Those two things, WACs and Fort Des Moines, like you say, is a big deal. Not just in Iowa. It's a big deal in the country.
Yeah. I mean, it is, we're the proving ground. Crazy as it sounds in 2023 that we should even have to ask these questions, they were 100% questions. There were people who were genuinely thinking that this is not going to work, that this is going to fail. That this is not a good idea. Very quickly, this place and the people who served here, of course, proved that wrong. Now, it didn't turn a switch in society. It's not like we had utopia after those moments. And in fact, one of the things that we do in the museum, we have a gallery called Between the Wars, where we try and contextualize our stories, because you hear these stories and you're like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. You've got these African-American men who go and serve in World War I, and they lead these troops, and then they come back and they have these amazing lives and have this legacy of service. They come back in 1919 into what's called the Red Summer. It's one of the worst periods of lynching in United States history. The women have this amazing experience. They learn all of these valuable trades, and many of them take advantage of the GI Bill to get educated and things like that. But it's not like suddenly we had gender equality and things like that. But there's still the moments that we have here at Fort Des Moines advance the ball.
It's advancing the civil rights. Were women integrated?
It is still a segregated army in World War II. On base, they are kind of sometimes integrated, but not. But the units are always segregated, and so there are times when in training they may be in the same spot. I've read a story about the cafeteria was segregated, and then the African American women protested and were able to get it integrated at some point. There are times when if you were walking at Fort Des Moines in 1944, where you would say, "Oh, this looks like it, it's kind of," but then there are other times in other spaces where you'd be, "Nope, this is clearly not an integrated army."
Yeah. I interviewed Thurman Sprague's son, which Thurman was one of the Tuskegee Airmen. And I think him and his wife, they met here.
Yeah, because I think I've met his son. I think his son has come to visit the museum before. I'm not 100% sure on that story.
Okay.
The black officers in 1917, it's only men here at that point, and then the women, when they're here, the only men on base are officers. But the experience in the military is certainly going to allow people to meet and get to know one another. And the other thing that the war does, World War II specifically, when you get sent to these different bases, you're getting to meet a cross-section of people that you may not have met before. If you're part of that very first class, Des Moines is the only place that's got one of these WAC bases. You're drawing women from every corner of the country. You're getting to interact with people that you otherwise would have never had any opportunity to interact with, both on a racial level, but also just on a, where are you from experience sort of level, rural, urban, West Coast, East Coast. So there was a lot of that interaction happening.
Yeah, and I wonder how many of those people who, especially those 70,000 women who came over here and they ended up staying after.
It's hard to know. I mean, this is the Edna Griffin story is one that is always challenging for me, because we have the fort has the photograph of Edna in her WAC uniform. It's probably the most famous image of her. It's the one you see most often. People will ask, "Oh, was she trained at Fort Des Moines?" And the best answer I can give is, I think so.
But we can't prove it.
I don't have her papers. I don't have something that states directly that she was trained at Fort Des Moines. I know that when she enlisted, there were only, I think, 2 WAC bases still open. This is one of them.
Okay.
I know she gets trained as an officer. I know that after the war, she comes to Des Moines. And my brain says, why on earth would she pick Des Moines other than she'd been here before?
Been here before.
And
I think that's what her son said.
Right.
I think that's what Stan was saying too. It's like, she knew Des Moines. That's why they ended up picking Des Moines to come back.
When I listened to that episode, I was so happy to hear him have basically the same impression as I do. He also doesn't have his mom holding the newspaper at the Des Moines Register, standing on the base with the date on it. Like that just, as far as anyone knows, that evidence doesn't exist. But he sort of is drawing the same conclusions that we are.
So 1917, this thing opened up. By 1942, you say, the WACs?
Yep.
Is that, at that time, was the man commissioner kind of start dwindling down a little bit?
So, good question. There is only one class of black officers here in 1917. That's it.
Oh, really?
Yep. They are here from June until October, and then they're gone. Never another class. That's it.
Oh, wow.
And
that was the class with like 1,200 of them?
Yep.
Okay.
So after World War I, this goes back to just being a cavalry base. And then as the cavalry sort of falls out of usefulness, it becomes a civilian military training camp for a while, becomes a field artillery camp for a while, and then the WACs come in 1942. So it is not that the story of those black officers is they are here from June until October. They are the only class in the entire country.
And after that, they're gone.
And after that, it's gone. Now, they will, once that glass ceiling has been broken, now there are opportunities for them to become commissioned officers. They can go through other channels. There's still severely limited opportunities, but the ceiling has at least been broken. So they don't have any more camps for that specific purpose. Now they just sort of go back to the normal channels, I believe.
1942, the wax. How long the wax training will go on?
The wax are here until 46, end of World War II, and then a few months beyond. And then it goes back to just being a military base. There's on-base housing here. We have a lot of folks who remember growing up here in some of the various buildings that were converted. Men were processed here before deploying for Vietnam. But over time, as is true for many military bases in the United States, as they become not particularly useful, they're very expensive, and so it starts to shrink. And so today, there's the only active military presence on the base is the 103rd Army Reserve next door. The rest of the base is gone. Oh, wow. Everything else has been sold off to developers or industry or anything like that. The museum, we own 2 historic buildings, Clayton Hall, the main building here, and then we have the chapel across the way. But other than that, all of the other historic buildings are owned by other entities, and most of them are gone.
And you guys, even over here, you guys kind of still hanging on a thread.
Yeah,
to keep this museum going.
Yeah, so this museum is run entirely by volunteers. We don't have any staff in our museum. We're open Saturdays from 10 to 4, so long as we've got board members who are available to open it, and we're pretty consistent about that. And then we're available for private tours and people who want to schedule things. We have a 100-plus-year-old building that is, 14,000 square feet, something like that. And we spend tens of thousands of dollars every year just to keep the lights on and the insurance bills paid and make sure the building is up and functional. That's not inclusive of repairs. That's not inclusive of programming. That's not inclusive of special tours or events or anything like that. Yeah. So, it is a challenge to keep the space up and running, but we're committed to that challenge because there's no better place to tell that story than here, than where it actually happened. And we want to make sure that those stories continue to get out there and continue to get told. And so we, as a board, keep fighting for every dollar and every cent that we can get. We write every grant that we can find and try and continue to fund this place so that it can continue to tell those stories.
How can the ordinary people help?
So a couple different ways. The first is just spreading the word. Awareness is never a bad thing. So telling people about the museum, sharing that story, pushing people to our website or pushing people to our YouTube page, and you can just Google those web addresses, and visiting the museum, bringing a group through. All of those are great ways to do it. We also could use additional volunteer support in every facet. So if you're someone who loves to work outside, we've got plenty of hedges that need to be trimmed, and we've got plenty of grass that needs to be cut. If you're someone that likes to work with, small construction projects, we've got porches that could be rebuilt. We've got eaves that have rotted away. If you are someone who loves the technology side, we would love help with a website. If you're someone who likes to do tours and programming, we would love assistance with that. And then finally, financial support. It is that simple in some cases. Whether it's a sponsorship from a business, a grant from a business or another nonprofit, or simple philanthropy and donations. We do not get any funding from the city, from the county, from the federal government, unless we get a grant. We've received grants from Polk County and places like that, but we don't get any consistent funding from any government entity at all. So any financial support that people can offer, whether it's as an individual putting $10 in the bin, or someone who wants to be a more significant supporter, all of that goes a long way.
Can you donate online?
You can.
Okay.
Yep, you can through our Facebook page. Certainly you can through the website. There is a GoFundMe account out there that you can donate to as well.
And the Facebook page is Fort Des Moines Museum and Education.
The stories don't disappear if the museum does. It becomes significantly more difficult to tell those stories without it.
Yeah. So when did this place become museum?
So the nonprofit was started, I believe, in 1998. But in terms of acquiring the building, I believe that happened in the early 2000s. To the best of my knowledge, and I wasn't around for any of this, but to the best of my knowledge, there was a fairly significant appropriation from the government to rehabilitate this building. It had fallen into pretty significant disrepair. And so they sort of built it back up and got the space up and functional. But then over the years, as that appropriation money ran out. It never got replaced with any sort of sustainable revenue source. And so they did a remarkable job of building the place up. That people come and they're like, wow, this is a beautiful building. You can see amazing potential in this space. It would be amazing event space for small events. You could even have offices here because it's a very large building. But, the maintenance is a challenge. It's every time we try and fix something and repair something, there's another thing that's next on the list. Where there's always another project.
And for the buildings with 100 years, those are usually the huge challenges.
Yeah, it's even small things. We have a porch that leads up to our main entrance, and we had a chairlift to make it accessible for folks. Well, that breaks. That company's no longer in existence. So we say, well, let's put in a ramp. Ramps, I think, are $17,000. So things that you never even think about being an expense, they add up very, very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And that's where the volunteer support becomes, immensely helpful. We get a lot of work done without paying for a salary or labor or things like that. But there's limitations to it. And so we would love to be able to hire someone, whether it's on a part-time or a full-time basis, to be a constant advocate for the museum, to be someone who is telling these stories more frequently and more regularly, to be someone who can build relationships with the community, to try and find more financial support. I think we do a very good job as a volunteer board, but there's only so many hours that the volunteer board can do. So that's really our next step is trying to find that sustainable operations income so that we can have someone who can be that advocate for the museum on a more consistent basis. This is something that I get asked from time to time, why people get invested in Fort Des Moines and why I get invested, because I'm not African American, I'm not female, I'm not military, I don't have any of those sort of experiential connections, but I very much see this place as ours. This is our history.
Oh, yeah.
And if we don't care about it, nobody else is going to. And there is something about, I'm sort of a history dork, but I think it's true even for those who are not as immersed in it. There is something about being at the place.
Yeah.
Seeing it, being there. Even what I think is the original entrance to the fort is actually off of Southwest 9th Street, and you can see the old stone arches that they're falling down. But you can see the old curved pathways that were the entrance to the parade ground. You can see the indentations in the ground. Wow. Like even that sort of stuff, I find
intriguing.
Yeah. This is Eleanor Roosevelt walked down that path. Charles Hamilton Houston, who this is probably as long as I've ever talked about Fort Des Moines without mentioning Charles. This is the man who's known as the man who killed Jim Crow. He's a graduate of Fort Des Moines. Charity Adams, who there's about to be a Tyler Perry movie made about her.
Yeah.
She's a graduate of Fort Des Moines.
Fort Des Moines.
Charles Howard, who, along with several gentlemen from Fort Des Moines, starts the Iowa Negro Bar Association and becomes a National Bar Association. It's Fort Des Moines. Yeah. What all of these individuals have in common is this place.
Yep.
And that's why we do the work that we do on the board of directors, to try and make sure that this place stands.
Stay alive.
And can remember that, because, as I said, I grew up here and had no idea that someone as significant as Charles Hamilton Houston had a connection to my home. Someone like Charity Adams had a connection to my home. Yeah. Someone like Charles Howard had a connection here. Someone like Eleanor Roosevelt visited here. Someone like Oveta Kolpabi visited here. Like, these are, Ronald Reagan served at Fort Des Moines. This is where it happened. But if the where disappears, then all you're left with are the photographs and the stories. And it's more powerful, I think, if you can partner those with the physical space.
Physical space, yeah. And the fact that you can think the first wax in the United States was here.
Yeah, and think about the legacy. Think about the thousands and thousands and thousands of women who have served our country since then.
Yeah. It all started here.
The origins of that story are here. Think about the thousands and thousands and thousands of African American men who have served as commissioned officers serving this country. That story starts here. And if here is not willing to, if Iowa and Des Moines is not, willing to save that story, nobody else is going to save it for us.
Yeah. Yeah, because there's something about when you walk at the place, the giant that walked before you, there's different feeling. It's like the fact you can walk in this building and you're like, oh, wow, so-and-so walked in here.
Right.
Actually, they got trained in here. It's different.
It is. The last pages of my next book end here at Fort Des Moines, and there is a very real location out on the corner of that parade ground that the character is standing on.
Really?
Thinking about, sort of the lineage that has brought him to that point. I at least would be sad if that spot were to disappear. I would be sad if those places were to be gone, because think about how few people know this story when this place exists.
Yeah.
What are the odds that there are going to be more people who know the story when the place doesn't? I think it becomes even less likely that people know the story.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes even less possible for people to engage. We've limited their opportunity to learn this history every time one of these places disappears.
What's the difference between Fort Des Moines and Camp Dodge?
So Camp Dodge, at least in World War I, that's where they were training enlisted troops. This is where we're training the officers. Today, Camp Dodge is a state site. It's a National Guard site, whereas this is a federal site with the Army Reserve. That's sort of the most general difference between the two. Some of the black officers who graduate from here are then sent to Camp Dodge to train African American troops who are training there, the enlisted men there. But yeah, that's the big difference in terms of our story.
You mentioned about 3 names. What's some of the famous black people that came through here?
Sure. The most famous I already mentioned, Charles Hamilton Houston.
Yeah.
He's from Washington, D.C., graduates from Amherst College, if I'm not mistaken, and then has the opportunity to come to Fort Des Moines. And he very much sees this as I think, I'm going to paraphrase, his quote is something to the degree of like, I want to have a say about this country, and this is a way that I can have a say about it. I feel like I'll have earned my say about it. So he comes here, trains as an officer. Because of his education, when he gets deployed, he's often asked to serve, not as a JAG, but in court-martials and things like that.
Yeah.
And while he's deployed, he really starts to get angry about the discrimination that black troops face. He's asked to prosecute a man who he believes did absolutely nothing wrong, and then he gets in trouble when that guy doesn't get charged with anything. He's not allowed to have his aide. It can't be a white man, even though he's entitled to have an aide based on his commission. He gets very angry about this, and he sort of makes this pledge that when he comes back from the war, he's going to spend the rest of his life fighting for people who can't fight for themselves. And so he goes to law school, gets his law degree. I think I want to say he edits the Harvard Law Review, serves as the dean of Howard Law School, and is the head legal counsel for the NAACP. And he will argue 8 cases before the United States Supreme Court. He wins 7 of them.
Oh, wow.
And he really mentors the generation of black lawyers whose names we now know. Thurgood Marshall is one of his mentees.
Okay.
Marshall has a great quote about him. When asked about Houston, Marshall said, "The rest of us were just carrying his bags." He starts the wheels in motion for Brown versus Board of Education, but he dies before that case really gets to Supreme Court. So Thurgood Marshall argues it in his stead. But it's really his experiences in the military, the leadership lessons that he learns here at Fort Des Moines that start to put him on that path. Charles Howard is another gentleman who graduates from Fort Des Moines. The exhibit in the museum says that he is a Des Moines native. I think he might have been born in South Carolina, actually. But he spends most of his life in Des Moines. He comes back from the war, graduates from Drake Law School, and will try and join the American Bar Association. They don't let him join it. So he and several other gentlemen who graduated from Fort Des Moines start the Iowa Negro Bar Association, which becomes the National Bar Association. He also has an interesting tie to Edna Griffin. So Edna Griffin is a black woman who is trained as a WAC, I think, at Fort Des Moines, moves to Des Moines after the war, and tries to get service from Katz's drugstores, denied service based on her race, and then takes that all the way to the Iowa Supreme Court. And segregation was already illegal in Iowa, but it wasn't being enforced. And it's really her case that sort of says that we're done with this. We're going to enforce these rules now. One of her lawyers is Charles Howard.
I did not know that.
So there's this sort of direct connection between our 1917 officers and our WACs as well. Charity Adams is probably the most famous female graduate from Fort Des Moines. She graduates in that first class in 1942. and then stays to train other WACs at Fort Des Moines.
Okay.
But she will lead the 6888 Postal Division. It's a unit of black women who get deployed overseas, first to England and then to France, to do postal operations in World War II. And they dramatically improve the efficiency of those operations. She comes back after the war and really spends the rest of her life in service to the various communities that she works in. She's probably the most famous female graduate.
Wow.
James Morrison, he's a longtime Des Moines resident.
Yeah.
He comes back after the war, buys the Iowa Bystander newspaper, and is the editor and owner of that basically until he dies for like 50 years.
AKA J.B. Morris.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he's part of our story. Dr. Frank Boston. This is why history is so interesting, right? You'd think there's only 1,250 of these guys. We didn't know anything about Dr. Frank Boston until we met a group out of Philadelphia who's trying to get him a third presidential citation. He is not part of the graduating class at Fort Des Moines, but Fort Des Moines also trained black doctors and dentists. And so he comes to the fort to train as a doctor. He's going to get deployed overseas during World War I. He comes back and starts an ambulance service in Philadelphia and starts a hospital that is now, if it's not the largest, it's one of the largest in the entire Philadelphia area. And he is the recipient of 2 presidential citations. He's from Fort Des Moines. Dr. Harlem Hospital, James Wright, he's a Fort Des Moines graduate. There's all of these names that sort of get lost because we know the 50s and 60s civil rights generation. We know more of their names. But these are the folks whose shoulders they're standing on. Mm-hmm. They're sort of setting some of those not very glamorous foundation pieces in place, giving those opportunities for that next generation to do the work they need to do in the 50s and 60s. There's all of these folks from all of these different corners of the world who then go and provide these amazing services to their country. And what they have in common is here. What they have in common is Fort Des Moines, and which makes it a uniquely remarkable place to tell those stories.
Absolutely. So the doctors and dentists, these guys came over here to be trained to go to war, but they came in, they were already doctors. They just
Some of them were, yes.
Okay.
I think Boston, for example, had already had some medical training when he comes.
Oh, so other came over here green? Completely, they were
I'm
not?
not sure.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
That's interesting.
But yeah, we've got a roster upstairs of all of their names.
Okay.
And there's an excellent book, and of course I'm not going to remember the title of it. There's an excellent book that actually is about the black doctors of World War I, and not all of whom came to Fort Des Moines, but many of them did.
So please come visit Fort Des Moines, Iowa. I mean, you can learn a lot. Give us the address.
So we are located at 75 East Army Post Road in Des Moines. We are open Saturdays from 10 to 4. It's a good idea to check our Facebook page just to make sure that we're not closed for some reason, but we're pretty consistent. And then we can book group tours by appointment. And again, the Facebook page is the best way to contact us about that.
Okay.
If you've got groups that want to come tour it, or if you want to set an appointment or a time to come and tour it, we're always happy to accommodate those as best we can. And then we also do presentations and talks about the fort. If you've got a Rotary Club or a library group or somebody who wants to know more about the fort, we're happy to come out and share those stories as best we can.
Okay. Man, Jeff, thanks very much for your time, man. I appreciate you keeping the story alive. I appreciate you volunteer for the last 7 years?
5 years.
5 years with the Fort Des Moines. We need people like you, man, to keep places like this going.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you for giving us the space to tell these stories. It's awesome to have a platform that can reach the people that are listening. Thank you.
I appreciate that.